Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of climate advocacy and are a vital voice during any substantive discussion on environmental policy. My final guest today is Galina Angarova, a member of the Buryat people, a Russian indigenous group. Galina is currently serving as the executive director of Cultural Survival, an indigenous-led NGO and U.S.-registered nonprofit advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples around the world. Previously, she was a representative of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group at the United Nations. Galina, it's great to be with you. I hope you've been able to hear. So this has been a great conversation. I feel so moved, lucky that I get to have this, and now I get to have this conversation with you. Can you tell us about cultural survival and about, as we talk about conservation and dealing with biodiversity and dealing with the planet, how the cultural dimension, and particularly Indigenous people, need to be a vital part of that equation?
It's greetings in my native language. Thank you for having me and elevating the voices of Indigenous peoples in this program. Cultural Survival is an Indigenous-led Indigenous rights organization that has existed for 50 years. We are a veteran organization that have uplifted the voices of Indigenous peoples, supported self-determination of Indigenous peoples, cultures, and political resilience since 1972. We work in 10 countries around the world, but we, of course, work on issues globally. And you can also learn about our work on our website, cs.org, and on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook at Cultural Survival. To answer your question, I just want to give a few statistics. Just to make a point, we are 476.6 million people around the world, which is roughly 6.2% of the total global population. However, we hold tenure of over 24% of the world's land surface. And these territories are home to 80% of the remaining biological diversity globally. A set of additional statistics, we manage at least 24% of the total carbon stored above ground in the tropical forests. And the lands of Indigenous peoples have shown to store 36% more carbon per hectare than public land. And these data is widely available. People can check it out, share with their circles. I think these are important data to know. There is a growing body of knowledge, of scientific knowledge, showing that when Indigenous peoples have the right to their lands, territories, and resources, that it benefits conservation greatly. And there are examples in such countries as Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Australia, that show that biodiversity is greater in Indigenous lands than in public lands or protected areas. So what's the magic ingredient? And the magic ingredient is the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples, or it's called traditional ecological knowledge. It is the body of knowledge, a vast body of knowledge that has been developed for millennia, passed down from one generation to the next, and adapted by each of the generations. It contains enormous information about what land is, the relationship between humans and its environment, and it can be complementary to the Western science. My true belief is that Indigenous peoples are the best stewards of our lands. We are the best experts of our environments. We even carry the knowledge in our land about our land and biological diversity in our languages. The silhouettes of the landscapes of our mountains, the sounds of nature are mimicked in our languages, in our songs and our dances. And there are over 4,000 Indigenous languages, and each language contains information about protection of our lands and protection of our biodiversity, biological diversity in our languages. So I just wanted to make that point, again, to emphasize that Indigenous peoples are the best experts of our environments.
I really appreciate that. Are you aware of any models, whether they're, state governments or national governments where the bridge between the knowledge that Indigenous communities have and the various kind of environmental stewardship responsibilities of government, where it's worked well? I mean, is there any place that you would say, hey, this is where we've gotten it right, this is where we've gotten it wrong?
I think that even though we've gained recognition of Indigenous rights on the international level, in 2007, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been adopted. However, the implementation is really weak. I'm not even sure there are a handful of examples. I know that Indigenous peoples of Belize have been able to gain their land rights in order to protect their biological diversity on these lands. But these examples are very sparse, I would say. Yeah, and then the point is that we can't talk about conservation and biodiversity protection without Indigenous peoples having their lands, their rights to the lands, resources, and territories protected through their national governments.
Right. Well, Galina, the other thing I want to offer to you, because you deal with your global networks. I think a lot of people don't realize that many Indigenous peoples are right at the forefront of the impact of the change in weather, of nature, of violent weather, of receding climates, of the diminishing biodiversity. In the Arctic. I mean, a lot of it. I mean, your network is the one that's feeling that pain now. What do you think how do I say this? Where are the red lights flashing the loudest in your communities?
Everywhere. It's true to say that we are on the forefront of climate change. In the Arctic, the receding ice is causing the Indigenous people to move, or it's impacting their subsistence resources and makes them unable to go out and hunt, for example, for walrus and other subsistence resources. Typhoons and hurricanes. I think one of the speakers mentioned that the coast of Guatemala, Honduras were hit by hurricanes. I think these communities are really incredibly impacted, and there will be definitely an impact. There will be impacts in the future. I'm thinking about communities in Africa, in the desert ecosystems in Africa that don't have access to clean drinking water. I'm thinking about my communities in Siberia that every single year are being affected by wildfires. And this is the result of climate change.
Wait, you just said you have wildfires in Siberia, so I did not know that. Can you tell us more?
I know that maybe a decade ago or more, the Russian government destroyed the Russian forestry system. The agency and 7,000 foresters lost their jobs, and which really impacted the state of the Russian forests. They used to do prescribed fires, which is no longer being done in the Russian forest. That led to increased fire hazards, but also the climate change impacts and the change in the weather patterns and conditions have exacerbated this problem. So as well as in California, where I live and work, I work and live from the Ohlone territory, which is now known as San Francisco Bay Area. We are being impacted by the fires the same way our Indigenous communities and the general population is being impacted in Siberia.
Galina, just finally, are you finding an open, an open door, an ear in the U.S. government today to your messages?
I would say no, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to speak about some of the things that we addressed on President's Day. We released a letter for the Biden-Harris administration to recognize the issues of Indigenous peoples, most importantly to operationalize the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the language on free, prior, and informed consent. I want to briefly talk about the new initiative, which is called 30 by 30, which is a global initiative, but it also been picked up by the Biden administration recently to conserve at least 30% of U.S. land and water by the year of 2030. As an organization, we support this initiative. However, we know all too well that if there are no safeguards and there are no protections for Indigenous peoples, there will be consequences, and the history will repeat itself. And there just have been too many consequences for Indigenous peoples in the past who have been thrown out, harassed, killed, all in the name of conservation, fortress conservation, all in the name of specially protected areas, all in the name of national parks. And we're asking the new administration to include the language on free, prior, and informed consent in this new initiative if it moves forward. And I want to take this opportunity to address the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, to meet with us, with a group of Indigenous women, leaders, activists, land defenders, climate change activists, to speak about this issue.
Well, I heard you. I've interviewed Deb Haaland on this show before, and so I hope she has heard you and many others have heard you. Galina Angarova, Executive Director of Cultural Survival, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our program today. A big thank you to the Natural Security Campaign and to all of you attendees for joining us for this discussion. If you missed any of these great conversations, we're going to have the video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.